right, we are back with our quilt square that we're making, and now the next step is going to be to finish it. We've got the quilt square made, and what I've done here is I've used my cutting mat and a ruler, and I have squared up all the edges. So I actually have a square here. All edges are the same length. We've got a 1 foot square. To make the binding, we're going to use, I'm going to use white fabric so that you can see it once we turn it onto the back. But I also want to just show you this piece that, well, it's not relevant to this project, except that on the back side, you can easily see what the binding looks like when it's finished. So, all right, so the next thing that we'll need to do is cut some strips for binding. So choose which fabric you want to use. I'm going to use white, just so that it doesn't interfere with my edges. When I turn it to the back side, I don't want to use, say, a red or something, because it will be visible a little bit right along the edge of the square. And sometimes you want that. In this case, I don't want that. So you'll cut some strips of fabric, and I like to make these 6 inches wide. Let me show you, I've already pressed these, but they're 6 inches wide, and you want them to be, I just cut long strips that are 6 inches wide, and then I cut them to the distance, to the length of the edge of my, well, about 1 inch shorter than the edge of the quilt square. And in this case, all the edges are the same. So I'm going to cut 4 strips that are 11 inches long. So they're 6 inches wide, 11 inches long. Then we're going to go, oh, and before we stop cutting, we're also going to then take some of the pieces left over that are 6 inches wide and cut 6-inch squares. 4 of those. So you need 4 6-inch squares, and you need 4 strips that are 11 inches long and 6 inches wide. All right, here's my 6-inch strip that's 11 inches long. I'm going to fold this in half lengthwise, and I'm going to iron or just press it so that you get a nice crisp edge. Try to be precise about the edges. That will be important. And then here are the 6-inch squares. Now they're a little trickier to get them to match exactly up on edges. We'll see how good your squares are when you do this ironing. So you press these into triangles. See what I've done there? And you do that with all 4 of them. So here we are with our four strips and 4 triangles. Everything is pressed in half properly. And here's how we're going to lay this out. Each triangle will be placed right in the corner. Now, I want to point out here, first of all, that my piece that I'm working on is face up. I'm working directly on the front of the piece. So, raw edges always together for this binding. So here's the raw edge, here's the folded edge. So you put your raw edges together in the corner, and it's obvious when you're doing the triangles. When you're doing the strips, you want to just make sure and double check yourself, because it's easy to get those turned around the wrong way. So you lay all your triangles into the corners. Then you take each strip, so raw edge here, raw edge here. We're going to lay this one down. again here. Now notice when I do this, it may be hard to see on here, but let me just slide this up under here. But notice that my edges of my strips are not coming all the way to the ends of the piece. And that's what we want, so don't be troubled by that. In fact, it just will reduce the amount of bulk that you get in the corners. All right, so all four, and I'm going to now just double check myself and make sure that I have all the folded edges to the inside of the piece, and it looks like I do. Now at this point, it's a matter of using your pins, or sometimes people like to use these little, I think they're called wonder clips, but they're just a little fabric clip that is helpful for things like this. So a lot of times I'll put these on just to kind of hold things still while I pin all the way around. So I'll just clip the corners, and then I'll spend some time pinning. And when I pin, I like to pin, let me turn this around. I like to pin like this. This is a very thick piece, so it's going to be hard to get the pins all the way through. But this is the orientation I like to use for all the pins all the way around, because number one, you don't want to pin it using your pins this direction, because that's where you're going to sew. This way you can pull the pin out as you approach it all the way around as you sew. Okay, and so I'll just spend some time now pinning this all together. So here we are. I've finished pinning and clipping all of the binding onto the piece. And now we're going to sew it. Now notice that this is what the back side looks like, and it's a little tricky here making sure that this all catches properly when you sew. So in order to do that, I'm going to leave myself a fairly wide, I'm going to do probably a 1/2 inch. I'm going to go about this wide on my binding. So about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now this is a really thick piece that we're sewing. And so I would point out that I'm using a quilting needle, which is a heavy duty needle that should hold up to the thickness of this piece. If your machine has an adjustment where you can leave the needle down in the fabric when you stop sewing, I recommend using that, because then you can lift your presser foot, turn your piece, and it will stay in there. Now I need to do one more stitch here. And I'm going to lift the presser foot, set it back down, and then we'll continue on here. Okay, so here we are, all done sewing our binding strips on. Okay, and now it's time to trim the corners, because we have such a thick piece here that if we don't cut some of this bulk off of the corners, it won't be nice and crisp when we turn it inside out. So I'm going to go along to each corner and just trim fairly close to my seam, but don't get too close. So I'm probably, I don't know, 1/8 of an inch from the seam, and then I'm just going to take a little more of this bulk off on each of the 4 corners. one more to go. And then if you wanted to, I'm not going to do this right now, but if you wanted to, you could lay this out, and using your straight edge and your rolling cutter, you could trim a little bit off of the seam here too. Okay, now the next step here is to just, I know this looks a bit like a mess right now, but you'll be surprised at how nice it comes out once we turn it. So now we're just going to turn all these corners inside out like this. Now, I find that using a chopstick is a really good way, or you could maybe use a skewer, but you'd want to use the back side of it, not the point. You don't want to drive a hole right through the corners. But notice with the chopstick, you can get right in the corner and push that corner out and make it nice and sharp. So you go around and do that on each corner. Then we're going to go to the ironing board and press this all down as well as we can to make it, try to make it stay flat. Then I'll explain the final step in a second. Okay, now we are the corners are trimmed, and I've turned everything inside out. Now I've got it on the back side, and I'm going to just press along the edge, carefully holding things so that we get a nice straight seam. And we'll do that on all four sides. Now notice how when you flip this over, you get a pretty clean seam here. So it's still going to pop up a little bit, but that's okay. I'll show you what we'll do to make that resolve once we get everything pressed down. So you'll have to finish this with a whip stitch, a simple whip stitch, where you will have to hold, what I do is I pin everything the way I want it, and then I do the whip stitch around it. And I'll just show you an example of a piece that I made where you can see that pretty easily here. And I think that you can see here the stitches that run along the edge. And then in the corner, I usually just tack the corner down so that it doesn't, just tack the corner down here so that it doesn't pop up. Okay, so I'm just pinning an edge here, and I'm going to just show you how I do this whip stitch. So I've just caught the fabric on the underside with a knotted thread, and then I'm just, this doesn't have to be fancy or look really good. It just needs to hold your binding down on the back side, because remember, the back side is not the focal point of the piece. So I just do this, and it takes some time, but the nice thing is it's very relaxing and very meditative. So you'll just do this whip stitch all the way around. When you get to your corners, just leave those for the moment. You'll come back when you're done with the whip stitch all the way around. Come back and just tack the corners to the under layer, and that should do it. And then this would be what your final piece will look like.